Hello fellow hunters and well met. We've just gotten off a week of Monster Hunter Wilds open beta test and there's been a common thread in just about every conversation. I think you know where I'm going with this. Things like performance, optimization, CPU bound. For many of us, this was an opportunity to get a feel for the weapons, the environment, and the hunts. For others, it was a brand new experience altogether, seeing for ourselves what all the hype has been about. It was absolutely an experience many of us will remember. But for as many people that talked about the content of the game, there were just as many, if not more, who had something to say about the beta's published specs, its demand on our hardware, and its actual performance in-game. This will be a follow-up to my prior video where I ran benchmarks against the beta on multiple PCs with varying hardware. In that video, there were comments from hunters with hardware ranging from entry-level to mid-range to the enthusiast segment. Even with hunters who had similar hardware amongst themselves, they reported wildly different experiences, largely inconsistent with one another. So, what's going on here? For me, this begged a lot of questions in my mind. How can hunters with similar hardware running the same game at similar settings produce such inconsistent results? Why did some hunters who have PCs that well exceed the recommended specs experience such trashy performance during the beta? Are we just going to have to suck it up and upgrade our hardware even if we meet the recommended specs? Today we'll be answering these questions and more. So what is going on with the beta test? Immediately after the demo released on Steam, videos popped up left and right where even the mighty 4090 could barely push frame rates north of 60 unless frame generation was turned on. This left a lot of hunters wondering if they would be able to play the game at all without shelling out for a hefty sum of new hardware just to play it. Or worse, they were completely disillusioned altogether. Discussions flooded the comments about optimization, whether or not needing frame generation for a playable experience was a reasonable ask, CPU bottlenecking, or optimal graphic settings for the best balance between performance and graphical fidelity. To try to answer this, I need to take a step back here first to talk about the intended purpose of the beta test. Capcom was rather upfront about this and what function the open beta test was meant to serve. Specifically, they mentioned things like networking load and overall operation. With a build version of 0.001.01.00, this is likely the earliest stable build, and I use that term loosely, they could put out as a beta to test the network load and server capacity. Remember, Wilds is the first Monster Hunter to feature crossplay. In prior titles, Capcom could utilize hardware platform servers to handle the multiplayer and online connectivity, where Microsoft would handle multiplayer for Xbox, Sony for PlayStation, Steam for PC, and so on. Ever been disconnected from a key moment in a multiplayer hunt when Steam did its Tuesday server reboot? Now you know why. Ultimately, this meant less development overhead and management for Capcom, but also meant that we were siloed to our respective hardware and could only play with other hunters on the same hardware. Crossplay requires that Capcom hosts and maintains their own multiplayer servers so multiplayer can be centralized, and players across different hardware can play with one another. The open beta served as the test they needed to gather valuable data on what they could feasibly sustain for a reliable multiplayer experience, especially with how ambitious and integrated Wilds multiplayer is. And this means that the intended purpose of the open beta was to gain insight into multiplayer as well as to identify bugs in the code, and not as a benchmark to determine the game's performance on our hardware at launch. In this regard, Capcom delivered. Sure, there may have been the occasional disconnect, but we were able to reconnect easily without queues or wait times to access a given lobby. Now let me be clear. I am not trying to undersell the blight that is AAA releases with absolute dog water performance because the devs couldn't be bothered to optimize. In fact, people who are quick to point out that optimization is a dramatic and legitimate issue have valid concerns here, as there's been this trend of bare minimum optimization efforts where devs just shrug and leave it up to DLSS and frame generation to pick up their slack. Again, needing a 4090, a GPU north of $2,000 US to push 60 frames per second without frame generation at 4K is egregious. Instead, I want us to understand the why of where we're at, to help give ourselves valuable context and insight as to what's actually happening. With such a preliminary build for the open beta test demo, we have to recognize that we can't judge this as the final product. On the other hand, we also need to understand these weaknesses in the here and now, so we have something to compare against when the game releases. If we take the time to identify these issues before release, we'll be able to determine if those issues are addressed when February rolls around. Additionally, if we understand the factors contributing to the problem, we're better equipped to communicate the exact nature of the problem we're experiencing, instead of just repeating words like optimization and CPU bottleneck over and over again.
Hello, IT?
This is the way that we as a community can provide meaningful feedback to Capcom, and furthermore hold them accountable to a well-polished product at the time of release. So then, what is it? Is it optimization? Is it CPU bottlenecking? Is it my hardware not good enough even though it meets the recommended specs? Or is there something going on that's entirely different altogether? And the answer is yes. All of these are potential factors to explain your experience with the beta, but let's start with the last question first. Is it something entirely different altogether? Something that springs to mind and has been a point of contention among gamers has been DENUVO, for example. Bellular News actually did an excellent video on the topic, which should help shed some light on whether or not we should be concerned or even blame DENUVO for perceived performance impacts. They also share what the typical use case for devs would be and how many devs will only keep DENUVO temporarily after a game's release, or ultimately drop DENUVO entirely. There's a card to the video at the top right, so you can watch that video after this one, but this is more a potential concern at game release, and not directly tied to the demo itself, so for the scope of this conversation, I'll be sticking to the things we were able to observe during the open beta test. So then, is it my hardware? As long as your hardware meets the recommended specs for 1080p as it's published on the Steam store page, you should be able to reach 60 FPS with frame generation. At bare minimum, what we should be expecting here is that Capcom's hardware requirements are dialed in and accurate as published. Hardware above that spec can then dip its toes into higher resolutions or even removing frame generation altogether. The point of contention about frame generation here is the question it begs. Is it reasonable for Capcom to expect us to rely on frame generation to hit 60 FPS? And that's... I've got feelings about that, but ultimately your mileage may vary and it's a matter of opinion. This, however, I do know. Frame generation benefits most from higher frame rates, not lower frame rates. So from where I sit, you can't reasonably expect low frame rates to suddenly make up the difference with frame generation enabled. Never mind the negative impact this has on input latency. It's really not a solution for hardware limitations. In addition to this, that same notice that Capcom published about their intentions for the open beta test also bears the caveat that certain aspects, such as game specifications, may differ in the full version. While I genuinely hope that this would mean Wild's spec will get better with the more polished the game gets, it's also entirely possible that Capcom could move the goalpost on us at some point and change the recommended specs towards more enthusiast hardware. Regardless of where Capcom lands, I would be dishonest with you if I didn't acknowledge that there does come a point where aging hardware will indeed have to be updated and upgraded to be able to produce the performance we're expecting. Either that or concessions will need to be made as to how high we can turn our graphical settings. We need to be honest about our hardware and set realistic expectations for ourselves as to what it can push. A 3060 isn't going to cut it if you want to run the game at the Ultra preset and 4K 120. A 1660 Super isn't going to be able to push frames like a 4070 will. So I want us to start from the perspective of understanding that hardware has its limitations before we tackle the real crux of the problem. For some of us, unfortunately, the bitter truth is that our hardware just isn't up to scratch, and no amount of optimization is going to fix that, which is something I want us all to at least bear in mind. But I'd like to assure you that aging hardware isn't the problem we're trying to solve for here. What this boils down to is determining what development issues have contributed to the poor performance, and trying to find answers for the inconsistent experience among hunters, even if their hardware may be far and above the recommended spec. When we compare to other games, we could get better frame rates out of The Last of Us or even Cyberpunk. So why are the benchmarks for Wild so low? Is the game actually CPU bottlenecked? I actually did a video covering this topic specifically. It was quite poorly received, believe it or not, but it covered the RE engine and how Dragon's Dogma 2 suffered greatly from severe CPU bottlenecking. This has been well documented, and the game still suffers from a measure of bottlenecking to this day. Interestingly, this is not something I was able to reproduce in any of my testing environments with the open beta. One of the key ways to identify if a game is CPU bottlenecked is to see the GPU failing to reach 100% utilization, with high utilization on the CPU instead. If your frame rate is low, but your GPU is only running at, say, 50% utilization, you've got a pretty clear indicator of a CPU bottleneck. With all 4 of my test bench PCs, this just isn't what's happened, even on the 3 that I tested with 4K Ultra settings. Although many are quick to point to Dragon's Dogma 2 as a shining example of the RE Engine CPU bottlenecking, we also need to remember that Monster Hunter Rise was built in the RE Engine too. So then, does that mean that the beta wasn't CPU bottlenecked? To answer that, we need to address the remaining question: is optimization to blame for the poor performance? And I'm sure that you're expecting this. Only partly. You see, game optimization takes shape in many ways, with tactics differing from hardware to hardware. To provide one such example would be occlusion culling, which unrenders objects that aren't visible to the player and thus frees up resources for what matters, the portion of the game that you can see. Another is asynchronous compute, where different tasks can be handled by the hardware without waiting for the task in front of it to finish first. If there are multiple tasks in the queue, we would be underutilizing GPU and CPU resources if these tasks were only processed one at a time. A low-effort task, for example, could leave precious computational power on the table while other tasks just sat there waiting in the queue. Asynchronous compute ensures that the remaining processing power would be utilized for another task that's also waiting in line, effectively increasing throughput and ensuring we're getting the most out of our hardware. Or how about an obvious optimization trick? Use multiple cores. There's no point in having an 8-core, 16-thread 7800X3D if the application maxes out only one core and leaves the other 15 completely unutilized. I'll let you take a wild guess, get it? At what was happening in the Monster Hunter Wilds beta test. That's right, Core 1 of my 11900K was maxed out at 100%. But my remaining cores were relatively idle, which explains why the average CPU utilization across all cores in MSI Afterburner was ultimately low. Unfortunately, I didn't get a screenshot or recording of the utilization of the individual cores, and the beta test is now over. Worse yet, other benchmarks on YouTube don't seem to share this same problem, and there's much more of an even distribution of workload across the CPU cores in the video on screen. So then, Wilds is CPU bottlenecked? Like, I'm confused here. Sure, if for some reason your CPU was only using a single core, like mine, to run the game, then yes, your experience was CPU bottlenecked. However, this single core behavior is something that I would consider more a bug than anything, as plenty of other hunters didn't share in that experience. If your experience was evenly distributed across your cores with relatively low utilization, like bang for bucks benchmarks here, then we can't say that Wilds is CPU bottlenecked at all, where in this example on screen the game is actually GPU bottlenecked with a 4090. Okay Jade, so we're not CPU bottlenecked that we can tell. Hooray! But a 4090 is? This somehow seems worse. And that's where we get into the crux of our problem. According to the highest settings possible in the Monster Hunter Wilds demo, we should only need about 8GB of VRAM. In all my testing, however, that's simply not the case. Sure, you might start out with utilizing 8GB of VRAM early on, but after a couple hunts, spending some time chilling in the base camp with your friends, and a little bit of exploring on the side, that value spikes to an eye-watering 18 to 19GB of VRAM utilization, maybe even more. Even Bang for Buck's benchmark here shows VRAM utilization well over the approximated 8 gigs. But then that almost suggests that everyone's going to need a 4090 regardless of whether we're playing in 4K or not, just to run the game at a decent frame rate. Even my 3090 only pushes about 80 frames per second in 1080p medium without frame gen turned on, so how could an RTX 2070, one of the cards recommended by Capcom themselves, hope to compete? And the short answer? It can't. But not because of optimization, and not because Capcom lied either. What you're seeing here is a memory leak. The unnaturally high amount of VRAM used is ultimately due to bad coding, where the garbage collection doesn't properly remove assets from VRAM that are no longer needed. Play the game long enough and eventually it exhausts all your VRAM. This is especially noticeable on cards with 8GB of VRAM or less, but also affected the 3080 12GB model in my wife's editing PC. When a new model loads on screen and there isn't enough VRAM to properly render it, your FPS takes a drop. What should only be a short time to load a given asset now takes full minutes, if it loads at all. And when it doesn't, want to take a stab at what happens? You guessed it, PS1, low poly assets, because that's all your VRAM can store. This further explains why multiplayer drastically decreases performance. You can play on a solo hunt or even a disconnected lobby and your frame rates will stay relatively stable. The moment that multiplayer is involved, performance drops. I had originally thought that this might be something in the netcode that was causing a performance impact, but now I'm quite confident it's due to loading so many models at once, thus exhausting your GPU's VRAM at an accelerated rate. This was something that occurred in just about every session I played. And from what I can tell, this impacts every card out there, as it's a matter of resource allocation and cleanup that causes artificial bottlenecks at the GPU level, and not the CPU level. Similarly, due to the bugginess of the beta, I would bet that this also explains why the workload wasn't distributed more evenly across all the compute cores of my CPU. Wilds isn't intended to be a single-threaded application. The problem we run into here is that this means that we can't directly test whether or not Wilds actually is CPU bottlenecked in the same way Dragon's Dogma was. So what does that mean for us? I mean, sure, you could go out and buy expensive hardware, but in my humble opinion, you don't need to fix this. Capcom does. Again though, I have to stress that this is a beta and the purpose of this video is to help hunters like you understand what sort of things contributed to your diminished gameplay experience. To be clear, I'm not making excuses for an unpolished product, but I want to drive home that something like this would not be a design choice and is a fairly normal symptom of a game in development. It's incredibly unlikely that Capcom would publish their target specs and then build a game so faulty that it's impossible for the recommended hardware to actually run it. Instead, this is very much evidence of an early build of the game that, even though it may be stable, it is both poorly optimized and heavily buggy. A memory leak is a pretty glaring flaw and one that would not pass any reasonable QA checks before release. To overlook this and allow these bugs to persist in the full release just wouldn't make sense from a business perspective, and would be a poor choice for Capcom when it comes to being right by their audience. What we do know, however, is twofold. First, the Monster Hunter team already has a build of the game that is improved over the beta. They spoke to this directly on their Twitter page after receiving reports about the afterimages created by frame generation. Whatever version they have now has already demonstrated technical progress over what we got to experience. Second, in an interview with Italian news outlet Multiplayer, Capcom spoke to their optimization efforts. While the screenshot has been translated by Google, it does appear that the final 6 months of development are being dedicated to optimization and polish on the final product. That stretches from September of this year all the way to February of next. The beta was only 1 to 2 months into this process, and is likely a build even further behind the state of the game before September, when the optimization efforts started. In addition to these two considerations, Capcom now has all the feedback from the beta straight from the community itself, which is valuable, first-hand, crowdsourced test data in real-world scenarios. This will greatly aid the dev work and optimization efforts over the coming months. As more and more of these issues are addressed during the development period, we'll have fewer and fewer performance issues and a much better product to perform tests on. In fact, they've come out and stated directly that they will be addressing common concerns from that feedback in a future post. Ultimately, I'm optimistic, and I genuinely think that you should be too. This is Capcom's bread and butter. Before we worry too much about Dragon Dogma's track record, remember that Monster Hunter Rise was also built in the RE engine. With time, it was able to run quite well. Dragon's Dogma crawled, so Monster Hunter Wilds could walk. If the release comes and we're still experiencing the same issues reported in the beta, then we know we have a problem. That's the time for us as a community to come speak out and hold Capcom accountable. But until then, let them cook. We'll save the final judgments regarding optimization, CPU bottlenecking, memory leaks, and realistic hardware requirements for the final product in February. I'm Jade, and I've been covering Monster Hunter Wilds since its announced in 2023. I'm incredibly excited for what the coming months will bring, and even more excited to share in those moments with you. On screen is a recommended video and a playlist of all the Monster Hunter Wilds videos I've done to date. Also, make sure to check out the videos I suggested in the cards as well. Until the next video, may the Sapphire Star guide your way. Until then, I'll see you in the comments below.